Inside a limestone cave on Mount Carmel, archaeologists found a set of holes cut deep into the rock. They did not look like much. Some were large enough to hold food. Others resembled heavy stone mortars, the kind people once used for pounding seeds. The cave itself, called Rakafet, had been used by Natufian hunter-gatherers as a burial place roughly 13,000 years ago. Human graves lay nearby. Flowers had once been placed with some of the dead. Then researchers looked inside the mortars. Microscopic starch grains clung to the stone. Their shapes had changed. Some showed signs of germination. Others had been heated, mashed, crushed, and transformed in ways that researchers could reproduce experimentally by making a primitive cereal brew. The stone had been holding a secret. Long before cities. Long before writing. Before people in this region were growing domesticated wheat and barley, somebody may already have been making beer. Not beer in a glass bottle. Probably something cloudy, thick, weak, and filled with grain particles. More liquid porridge than modern lager. But fermented. And apparently made on purpose. That discovery changes the question. Because humans did not create alcohol itself. Microorganisms had been producing ethanol for millions of years before our species appeared. Fruit split open. Sugary sap leaked from plants. Yeasts reached the sugar, multiplied, and transformed part of it into alcohol. Nature already knew the chemistry. What humans discovered was how to make it happen again. So how did humans discover alcohol? There was almost certainly no single moment. No prehistoric inventor staring at a bowl and realizing that fermentation had begun. The first encounter left no writing and perhaps no object that archaeology could ever recover. Instead, the surviving evidence shows a series of discoveries. First, humans encountered fermentation. Then they learned to encourage it. Then they learned to control it. And once they could control alcohol, alcohol began changing them. Start with something as ordinary as damaged fruit. A ripe fruit is essentially a package of water and sugar. Break its skin and microorganisms gain access. Yeasts capable of alcoholic fermentation consume simple sugars and release ethanol and carbon dioxide. The chemistry is elegant. The yeast gets energy. The human gets alcohol. Nobody needs to understand cells, enzymes, or molecular pathways for this to happen. A container of sweet juice can begin changing without anyone deliberately adding yeast at all. Microorganisms can arrive on the fruit, the vessel, tools, insects, or the surrounding environment. That makes fruit wine fundamentally different from something like a metal sword or a glass lens. Those objects require human manufacture before they exist. Alcohol does not. A prehistoric person could have discovered its effects simply by encountering food that nature had already fermented. We cannot know when that first happened. It could have occurred hundreds of thousands of years before the earliest archaeological brewery. A fallen fruit or leaking tree sap does not fossilize conveniently. Neither does intoxication. The evidence disappears. Ethanol is especially troublesome for archaeologists because it is volatile. Thousands of years later, the alcohol itself is usually gone. Researchers therefore look for indirect clues: altered starch grains, plant residues, characteristic acids, vessel shapes, brewing installations, microscopic wear, or combinations of chemicals associated with particular ingredients. Archaeology is not finding ancient alcohol. It is finding the fingerprints of a vanished process. That is why Rakafet Cave matters so much. The Natufians who used the cave lived during a remarkable period in human history. They were hunter-gatherers, but many Natufian communities were becoming increasingly sedentary. They built structures, harvested large quantities of wild plants, used heavy grinding equipment, buried their dead in formal cemeteries, and gathered in ways that were beginning to resemble the social life of later farming villages. The Rakafet researchers analyzed 3 stone mortars using residue analysis, use-wear studies, and experimental reconstruction. Their interpretation suggests a multi-stage process involving wild cereals, such as wheat or barley. First came germination. When cereal grains begin sprouting, enzymes inside the seed start converting stored starch into sugars that the young plant can use. Brewers exploit exactly that process today. Stop the germination at the right point and you have malt. Then the malt can be crushed and mixed with water. Heating helps release and convert more of the starches. Once enough fermentable sugar is available, yeast can take over. This is much harder than making fruit wine. Grapes already contain accessible sugar. Grain mostly contains starch. Yeast cannot simply attack a bowl of dry barley, and produce useful quantities of alcohol. The brewer must first unlock the sugar. Malting and mashing solve that problem. That means the activity proposed at Rakafet was not just a forgotten bowl of berries becoming strange overnight. If the interpretation is correct, these people understood a sequence. Wet the grain. Let it change. Dry or process it. Crush it. Add water. Heat it. Let another invisible transformation begin. They did not know what an enzyme was. They did not know yeast was alive. They only knew the pattern worked. And the location may tell us why they bothered. Rakafet was a burial site. The research team has argued that the beverage was probably connected to feasts associated with the dead. That possibility is more important than it first appears. Alcohol may not have begun as an efficient source of everyday calories. Producing a cereal brew from wild grain could require enormous effort. Harvesting, carrying, germinating, pounding, heating, and waiting are expensive activities when every calorie comes from human labor. Yet people regularly spend more effort on food when the food means more than nutrition. Wedding cakes are inefficient. Religious offerings are inefficient. Feasts are inefficient. That is part of their purpose. They convert food into social meaning. A rare, intoxicating drink could do something ordinary, grain could not. It could alter mood, lower inhibition, mark a ceremony, distinguish a special day, or make a gathering memorable. The biological effect became a social tool. This does not prove that beer caused agriculture. That idea remains controversial. But the chronology makes a simpler point possible. Alcohol did not have to wait for civilization. People could seek fermentation before farms produced giant surpluses. And Rakafet was not the only experiment. Several thousand years later, another extraordinary beverage appears in the archaeological record more than 6,000 kilometers to the east. At Jiahu, an early Neolithic village in what is now Hainan province in China, researchers analyzed residues absorbed into pottery vessels dating to roughly the 7th millennium BCE. The drink was not beer. It was not wine. It was not mead. It was all three at once. Chemical and archaeological evidence indicates that people at Jiahu were making a fermented mixture containing rice, honey, and fruit, probably hawthorn fruit and possibly wild grape. Each ingredient solved a different problem. Honey contains sugar. Fruit contains sugar. Rice contains starch, which must be converted. Put them together, and prehistoric fermentation stops looking like a single recipe accidentally copied across Eurasia. It looks like experimentation. People used whatever their environments provided. That pattern would repeat around the world. Where grapes grew, people fermented grapes. Where cereals dominated, people developed grain beverages. Where honey was available, diluted honey could become mead. Where palms produced sugary sap, people could ferment palm wine. Different plants. Same microbial trick. Humans were converging on alcohol because sugar and yeast kept presenting them with the same opportunity. The Chinese evidence also exposes a problem with modern categories. Today, supermarket shelves separate beer from wine, from spirits as if these were natural divisions. Early fermentation was messier. A drink could contain cereal, fruit, honey, herbs, and microorganisms all at once. Ingredients were not organized according to modern tax codes or beverage competitions. The goal was transformation. And once pottery became widespread, that transformation became easier to manage. A clay jar does something a puddle or animal skin cannot do very well. It creates a controlled space. You can fill it, cover it, store it, move it, reuse it. Most importantly, its porous walls can preserve chemical residues for thousands of years. In the South Caucasus, pottery provides some of the strongest early evidence for grape winemaking. At sites in what is now Georgia, including Gadakrili Gora and Shulaveris Gora, researchers found large Neolithic jars dating to around 6,000 to 5,800 BCE. Chemical analysis detected tartaric acid and other compounds associated with grape and wine, while archaeobotanical evidence showed grapes were present in the environment. The jars were huge compared with drinking cups. They appear suited not merely to serving liquid, but to fermenting and storing it. That is a technological threshold. Finding fermented fruit is discovery. Putting grape juice into a vessel because you expect fermentation is production. Keeping that vessel through the process is control. A few centuries later, at Haji Firuz Tepe, in what is now Iran, 6 large jars were embedded along the wall of a Neolithic house. Each could hold roughly 9 liters. Residue inside analyzed jars contained evidence consistent with grape wine, as well as terebinth tree resin. The resin is intriguing. Wine spoils. Oxygen and microorganisms can turn a successful batch into vinegar or something worse. Tree resin has antimicrobial properties and was later widely used in ancient wine traditions. We cannot interview the person who added it, but if the resin was being used to help preserve wine, then fermentation had already produced a second problem. Humans had learned how to make alcohol. Now they had to learn how to stop other organisms from destroying it. Every successful fermentation technology is therefore a negotiation with invisible life. Encourage these microbes. Suppress those microbes. Keep the temperature inside a useful range. Provide the right food. Wait long enough. Do not wait too long. For most of history, people did all of that without knowing microbes existed. They learned by smell, taste, sound, texture, foam, temperature, sediment, and repetition. A brewer might notice that one vessel worked better than another. A household might preserve a successful sediment and mix part of it into the next batch. A bakery and brewery could exchange fermenting material. A community could favor a particular container, season, temperature, or grain without knowing why it mattered at the molecular level. That is domestication without a microscope. Not just domestication of plants. Domestication of a process. By the time cities appeared in Mesopotamia, alcohol had moved far beyond rare experimentation. It had entered administration. This is where a drink becomes an institution. The earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia developed largely around accounting. Grain had to be counted. Workers had to receive rations. Goods had to be delivered, stored, and redistributed. Beer appears inside that bureaucratic world. Surviving cuneiform tablets record beer rations alongside bread, oil, onions, and other provisions. One tablet from the Ur-3 period lists beer intended for messengers. Later, Babylonian tablets record beer allocations in similarly ordinary administrative language. That matters because the tablet does not describe a party. It describes a system. Alcohol had become predictable enough to budget. A government or institution could know that a certain quantity of grain would eventually become a certain quantity of beverage. Brewers could work to expected standards. Storehouses could issue it. Scribes could count it. A microbial accident had entered the spreadsheet of the ancient world. Mesopotamian religion absorbed it too. Ninkasi, a Sumerian deity associated with beer, was celebrated in a hymn that also preserves descriptions of brewing. Scholars debate exactly how literally the text can be reconstructed as a recipe, but the larger point is clear. Brewing had become specialized knowledge worthy of memory. The knowledge could be transmitted. That changed alcohol permanently. If one generation merely discovers fermented juice, the discovery can vanish. If a community encodes the process in routine, ritual, tools, songs, and occupational knowledge, it survives. Recipes are cultural DNA. And once alcohol could be produced reliably at scale, rulers found uses for it. Around 3000 BCE, at Abydos in Egypt, a brewery operated on a scale that would have been astonishing in earlier villages. Archaeologists investigating the site have documented 8 large brewing installations. Rows of ceramic vats were used to heat grain and water mixtures. If the whole facility operated together, the brewery could produce more than 20,000 liters in a batch. This was not somebody experimenting in a kitchen. It was industry. The brewery stood in a sacred landscape associated with Egypt's earliest kings. Archaeologists have proposed that its enormous output helped supply royal rituals and funerary ceremonies. That connection reveals another transition. Alcohol could now magnify political power. Imagine what is required to produce thousands of liters at once. Fields, grain, fuel, water, pottery, brewers, people transporting ingredients, people maintaining fires, people cleaning containers, people distributing the finished drink. A king who could mobilize all of that was not merely offering beer. He was displaying coordination. The feast demonstrated that the ruler could command land, labor, food, and time, then transform all 4 into abundance. The intoxication was part of the spectacle. So was the logistics. Alcohol became useful because its effects worked at several levels simultaneously. It provided calories. It could be offered to gods and the dead. It marked hospitality. It lubricated social gatherings. It rewarded labor. It became a commodity. And yes, it could make people drunk. That last effect was never culturally neutral. Societies celebrated intoxication and feared it, often at the same time. Drinking could create solidarity, but it could also produce conflict. Taverns could become economic institutions and places authorities distrusted. Ritual drinking could be sacred in one setting and unacceptable in another. The technology produced a regulatory problem almost as soon as it produced a market. There is also a popular explanation for ancient beer that deserves caution. People often say ancient societies drank beer because water was unsafe. Sometimes fermented drinks may indeed have been safer than contaminated water, especially when preparation involved heating. But that cannot explain the origin of alcohol as a whole. Early humans knew how to locate usable water, and brewing itself requires water. Alcohol survived because it offered something water could not: taste, energy, preservation in some contexts, ritual value, trade value, and a chemical effect on the brain. Then, for thousands of years, the strength of alcoholic drinks faced a biological ceiling. Fermentation makes ethanol, but ethanol is toxic to the yeast producing it. As alcohol concentration rises, yeast metabolism becomes increasingly stressed. Depending on the organism and conditions, fermentation slows and eventually stops. That is why traditional fermented drinks have limits. You can select better yeast. You can provide more sugar. You can control temperature. But at some point, the organism poisons its own environment. To go further, humans needed another technology: distillation. The principle is simple to describe and difficult to perfect. Heat a fermented liquid. Different components enter the vapor at different rates. Because ethanol is more volatile than water, the vapor can become richer in alcohol than the original drink. Guide that vapor away, cool it, and it condenses back into liquid. Now repeat. Fermentation lets microbes manufacture ethanol. Distillation lets humans concentrate it. The equipment developed gradually from a much broader history of chemical experimentation. Ancient and late antique craftspeople used distillation-like apparatus for substances such as perfumes and medicinal preparations. Greek alchemical writings describe sophisticated equipment. Scholars working in Arabic and Persian intellectual traditions later developed and refined distillation techniques and apparatus, transmitting a rich practical chemistry that would strongly influence medieval Europe. This history is more complicated than the claim that one person invented liquor. The technology existed before distilled spirits became an ordinary beverage. Across roughly the period from the 9th through 13th centuries, concentrated alcoholic distillates became increasingly important in parts of China and the Western Eurasian world. In medieval European texts, distilled wine acquired names like aqua vitae, water of life. The name tells us what people thought they had found. Not a stronger party drink. An essence. A medicine. Something extracted from wine itself. Distillation broke the old biological ceiling. Suddenly, alcohol could become dramatically more concentrated than fermentation alone normally allowed. And concentrated alcohol behaves differently in an economy. Beer contains a great deal of water. Wine contains a great deal of water. Spirits pack more alcohol into less weight and volume. They store well. They travel well. They can be sold in small quantities at high value. That made distilled alcohol exceptionally compatible with long-distance commerce. It also magnified the consequences of drinking. The Atlantic world provides one of the clearest examples of both processes operating together. During the 17th century, Caribbean sugar producers began fermenting and distilling byproducts of sugar manufacture into rum. Economically, the idea was brilliant. Sugar production created material that could be turned into another valuable commodity. But there was nothing benign about the system producing it. Caribbean sugar plantations depended on enslaved labor. Enslaved people cut cane, operated mills, worked around boiling sugar, moved fuel in barrels, and performed the dangerous labor that made sugar, molasses, and rum profitable. Rum entered Atlantic trading networks built around colonialism and slavery. In some networks, distilled alcohol itself became a commodity used in exchanges connected with the buying and selling of enslaved Africans. The drink had completed a disturbing transformation. At Rakafet, fermented grain may have helped a small community gather around its dead. In the Atlantic plantation economy, alcohol could sit inside a commercial machine spanning continents and treating human beings as property. The chemistry had not changed. The scale had. That distinction matters throughout the history of technology. A discovery is not defined only by what it can do. It is defined by the system built around it. And even after people had brewed alcohol for thousands of years, they still did not actually understand fermentation. They could control it brilliantly. They could not see its cause. That mystery survived into the 19th century. Then Louis Pasteur began investigating why industrial fermentation sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed. French producers had money at stake. A vat that spoiled was not an interesting scientific curiosity. It was lost income. Beginning in the 1850s, Pasteur showed that fermentation was connected to the activity of microorganisms. Alcoholic fermentation was not simply grain or grape juice decaying according to some vague chemical tendency. Living organisms were involved. That revelation closed a circle more than 10,000 years old. Prehistoric brewers had learned to manipulate microbes they could not see. Pasteur finally made the invisible worker conceptually visible. Once producers understood that different microorganisms caused different processes, brewing and winemaking could become far more controlled. Contamination could be studied. Equipment could be cleaned more systematically. Desired yeasts could be selected and propagated. Temperature could be monitored scientifically instead of judged only through inherited practice. Later, work went deeper. In 1897, Edward Buchner demonstrated that extracts from yeast cells could ferment sugar even without living yeast cells being present. Fermentation depended on biochemical agents inside the cells, enzymes. A prehistoric mystery had become biochemistry. Sugar went in. Enzymatic pathways rearranged molecules. Ethanol and carbon dioxide came out. For the first time, humans could explain in molecular terms what countless generations of brewers had known through touch, smell, and experience. Industrial production pushed control even further. Breweries and wineries could maintain selected cultures. Modern microbiology reduced unwanted variation. Stainless steel replaced porous containers in many settings. Refrigeration made temperature control routine. Laboratory analysis could measure sugar, acidity, microbial populations, and alcohol concentration with a precision impossible to ancient brewers. The wild process became standardized. And that creates the final paradox in the story. The better humans became at controlling alcohol, the larger the problem of alcohol could become. A Natufian feast required gathering wild grain and processing it by hand. A modern factory can produce enormous quantities continuously. Distribution networks can move it around the planet. Marketing can turn particular beverages into identities and rituals on a scale no prehistoric community could imagine. The substance is culturally familiar. Its biology has not become harmless. Ethanol is psychoactive. It is toxic. It can produce dependence. According to the World Health Organization's latest global assessment, alcohol consumption was attributable to about 2.6 million deaths worldwide in 2019, through diseases, injuries, and other causes. That does not erase thousands of years of alcohol's place in food, religion, medicine, celebration, diplomacy, and hospitality. It completes the picture. Humans discovered a natural process that changed consciousness. Then we spent millennia making that process more reliable, more concentrated, more transportable, more profitable, more available. The history is not a simple rise from accidental rotten fruit to sophisticated wine. It is a series of bargains. Yeast gives up ethanol because of its own metabolism. Humans give grain, fruit, labor, containers, and time. Communities gain a substance capable of making a ceremony feel different from an ordinary meal. States gain something that can be rationed, traded, regulated, and taxed. Merchants gain a commodity. Drinkers gain pleasure and intoxication, and some people pay a far higher price than others. So how did humans discover alcohol? Probably not by inventing anything at first. Some unknown people encountered sugars that microorganisms had already fermented. They noticed that the food or liquid tasted different. More importantly, it made them feel different. They returned to it. Eventually, someone stopped waiting for nature. People gathered fruit into containers. They diluted honey. They malted grain. They mashed starch into sugar. They preserved successful methods. Different societies found different routes, because fermentation does not belong to one civilization. Wherever humans had sugar, starch, water, microorganisms, and enough curiosity, some form of alcoholic fermentation could emerge. The oldest evidence we currently possess is not necessarily the beginning. Roquefort may move the visible history of cereal brewing back roughly 13,000 years. Jaha reveals another sophisticated fermentation tradition in Neolithic China. Early Georgian jars show grape winemaking, established by around 6000 BCE. Mesopotamian tablets show beer becoming bureaucracy. Abydos shows it becoming royal industry. Distillation turns a biological product into a concentrated chemical commodity. Pasteur finally reveals the organisms that had been doing the work all along. There was no single inventor. There was a chain of observers. Someone noticed sweetness changing. Someone noticed bubbles. Someone noticed the feeling afterward. Someone learned that sprouted grain worked better. Someone saved the sediment from a successful batch. Someone sealed a jar. Someone built a larger vat. Someone counted the rations. Someone distilled the vapor. Someone finally looked through a microscope. And back at Rakafet Cave, the alcohol itself is gone. Of course it is. 13,000 years is far too long for a drink to survive. What remains are tiny damaged starch grains trapped against stone, invisible without modern instruments. The people who made whatever was in those mortars could not have imagined enzymes, ethanol molecules, chromatography, or laboratory microscopes. They knew only that grain, water, heat, and time could become something else. They had discovered the effect long before humanity discovered the cause. And in that sense, the oldest surviving history of alcohol is not preserved in a bottle. It is preserved in an empty stone bowl.